A police officer's hands are roughly patting down a young, well-dressed black man against a car at night. The officer's report was perfect. The evidence was clear. The case was closed. But she knew the perfect crime always has one tiny flaw. He thought his camera was his alibi. He never suspected. It would be his confession. They tried to bury a man with a lie. They had no idea he was about to bury them with the truth. Officer Daniel Miller hated the night shift. Not because of the dark or the strange, lonely hours, but because the darkness seemed to make everyone else uglier. In his 15 years with the Chicago PD, he had developed a worldview as hard and as gritty as the city pavement. The world was divided into predators and prey, and his job was to be the biggest, smartest predator of them all. He was a man who saw guilt in every shadow and deceit in every pair of eyes that didn't look like his. He prided himself on his street smarts, an instinct he believed was infallible, an instinct that told him exactly who belonged in a neighborhood and who didn't. Tonight, that instinct was screaming at him. The target was a pristine, 5-year-old Lexus, cruising slowly through the manicured, tree-lined streets of Lincoln Park, a wealthy, predominantly white enclave. The car was perfect, the driver was careful, but to Miller, it was a glaring anomaly. The driver was a young black man. Inside the car, 24-year-old Marcus Hayes was lost. Not in a dangerous way, but in a simple, human one. He was a recent architecture graduate who had just landed his dream job at a prestigious downtown firm. He was on his way home to his modest apartment after a grueling late night at the office and had taken a wrong turn, his phone's GPS struggling to recalibrate. He was admiring the beautiful, historic brownstones, making mental notes of their design, his mind filled with blueprints and possibilities. He was a young man on the cusp of his future, a world of clean lines and creative ambition. He didn't notice the patrol car until its blue and red lights filled his rearview mirror, a sudden, violent slash of color in the quiet, sleeping neighborhood. A cold, familiar dread, a feeling he had been taught by his father since he was a boy, settled in his stomach. He had done nothing wrong. He was driving his father's car. He was wearing a suit. But he knew, with a certainty that was as deep and as bitter as history itself, that none of that mattered. He pulled over, his hands already visible on the steering wheel, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Miller approached the car with a practiced, swaggering calm, his hand resting casually on his holstered weapon. He shone his flashlight into Marcus's face, a deliberate, dehumanizing glare. License and registration, he barked, not as a request, but as a command. You in a hurry tonight, son? Marcus complied silently, his movements slow and deliberate. No, officer. Just a little lost. Trying to get back to the expressway. Miller took the documents, his eyes scanning them with a theatrical suspicion. Marcus Hayes, he read aloud. This isn't your neighborhood, is it, Marcus? What are you really doing here? Casing the joints? Looking for an easy score? The accusation was so baseless, so nakedly prejudiced, that for a moment, Marcus was speechless. I'm an architect, sir, he said finally, his voice tight. I was just driving home from work. Miller let out a short, ugly laugh. An architect? Right. And I'm the mayor of Chicago. Step out of the car. This was wrong. Marcus knew his rights, but he also knew the brutal calculus of a roadside confrontation. Arguing would be seen as resistance. Resistance would be seen as aggression. He got out of the car, his hands still raised and visible. Miller pushed him against the side of the Lexus, the cold metal a shock against his suit jacket. You got anything on you I should know about? Any weapons? Any drugs? Miller began to pat him down, his movements rough and invasive. No, sir, Marcus said, his voice a low, steady murmur, a mantra of compliance. While his partner, a younger, nervous-looking officer, watched from the patrol car, Miller began to search the Lexus. He tore through the glove compartment, tossing papers onto the passenger seat. He looked under the seats. He found nothing. He was getting frustrated. His infallible instinct was failing him, and it was making him angry. The prey was refusing to act like prey. As he moved to search the trunk, a new, colder idea began to form in his mind. He would not be made a fool of. If the evidence wasn't there, he would create it. He turned his back to Marcus for a moment, a subtle, almost invisible movement of his hand toward a small pouch on his duty belt. He was so focused on his plan, so certain of his absolute power in this dark, lonely street, that he had forgotten about the one, silent, and impartial witness that was watching his every move. It was the small, black, city-mandated body camera, clipped to the center of his chest, its tiny LED light glowing with a steady, recording, and unforgiving red. The body camera was a recent, department-wide mandate, a political concession to a city screaming for police accountability. To most cops, it was a nuisance, a bureaucratic leash. To Officer Miller, it was a joke. He knew its blind spots, its weaknesses. He knew that a well-placed hand, a technical malfunction, a conveniently timed turn of the body could render it useless. He was a master of the shadows, both literal and procedural. But tonight, in his arrogant certainty, he had forgotten the first rule of the new world. The camera is always on. The small, red light on his chest was a silent, digital eye, capturing everything with cold, objective clarity. He opened the trunk of the Lexus. Inside was exactly what a young architect would have: a portfolio of drawings, a hard hat, a pair of dusty work boots. There was no sign of anything illegal. "What do we have here?" Miller said loudly, a performative announcement for his partner and, he believed, for the in-car microphone. He reached into the trunk, his body momentarily shielding his hands from the view of Marcus, who was still pressed against the side of the car. From a small, hidden pocket in his tactical vest, Miller's fingers withdrew a small glassine baggie containing a chalky white powder. It was a plant, a piece of evidence from a previous bust, a tool of the trade he kept for situations just like this, for when his instincts were right but the suspect was lucky. With a swift, practiced movement, he dropped the baggie into the side pocket of the portfolio. Well, he boomed, turning around, holding the portfolio in one hand. "Looks like our architect is a man of many talents." He reached into the pocket and pulled out the baggie with a theatrical flourish, holding it up in the beam of his flashlight. "What do you call this, Mr. Hayes? A blueprint?" Marcus stared at the baggie, his mind reeling. He felt a wave of nausea, a feeling of profound, terrifying unreality. This was not happening. This was the kind of story his father had warned him about, a nightmare whispered from one generation of black men to another, a ghost story that was suddenly, horribly real. "That's not mine," he said, his voice a choked whisper. "I have never seen that before in my life." You put that there?" The accusation was the spark Miller had been waiting for. "He's getting aggressive," Miller shouted to his partner, resisting arrest. In a single, violent motion, he slammed Marcus against the car, twisted his arms behind his back, and cinched a pair of handcuffs around his wrists with a painful, metallic click. The younger officer, startled into action, now rushed over to assist. Marcus didn't fight. He went limp, his mind a chaotic storm of fear and a single, clear, cold thought: don't resist. Survive. Just survive this. As he was being forced into the back of the patrol car, the world a dizzying blur of flashing lights and shadows, he saw Miller walk back to the trunk. He watched as the officer carefully picked up the baggie with a pair of gloved fingers, a perfect pantomime of proper evidence handling for the camera he thought wasn't recording his hands. He then saw Miller reach up to his chest and, with a subtle tap, deactivate the body camera, its small red light winking out into the darkness. But the eye had already seen everything. The next 24 hours were a descent into a bureaucratic hell. Marcus was booked, fingerprinted, and thrown into a holding cell that smelled of bleach and despair. He was no longer a promising young architect. He was a statistic, another young black man caught in the gears of the system. His one phone call was to his parents, his voice trembling with a mixture of shame and fury as he tried to explain the impossible. His father, a man who had worked his entire life to build a world where this wouldn't happen to his son, was a study in controlled rage. He promised to get a lawyer, the best lawyer they could afford. The initial hearing was a formality. The arresting officer's report, written by Miller, was a masterpiece of fiction. It painted a picture of a suspicious vehicle in a high-crime area, a lie, a nervous and uncooperative suspect, a lie, and the discovery of narcotics during a routine search, a lie. The judge, seeing a clean-cut young black man in a suit and a veteran officer's sworn statement, set a high bail. The system was working exactly as it was designed to. The family hired a civil rights attorney named Elena Rodriguez. She was in her 40s, a small, fierce woman with eyes that had seen the very worst of the system and had not yet learned to blink. She met with Marcus in the small, gray interview room of the county jail. She listened to his story, her expression unreadable, her pen flying across her notepad. She had heard 100 stories like this. The details were always different, but the architecture of the injustice was always the same. He said, she said, she explained, her voice devoid of false comfort. In a courtroom, it's a veteran officer's word against yours. We lose that fight 9 times out of 10. But he planted it, Marcus insisted. I saw him. He turned his back, and he planted it. Elena nodded slowly. I believe you, she said. But a jury won't. Not without proof. The official report says Officer Miller's body camera malfunctioned during the search of the trunk due to a low battery issue. She paused, her gaze intense. But it also says the camera was active during the initial stop and the pat-down. The law requires them to turn over that footage. It's our only shot. If there is a single crack in his story, a single inconsistency, I can use it to tear his entire testimony apart. A week later, after a series of formal, demanding requests, a DVD containing the footage arrived at her office. It was exactly as the report had stated, 57 seconds of the initial stop, followed by a screen of black. She sat in her darkened office, the glow of the monitor illuminating her face, and began to watch the footage, frame by agonizing frame, searching for the one, small, beautiful lie that would set her client free. The body camera footage was a study in choreographed deception. The video quality was grainy, the audio a distorted mess of traffic noise and radio chatter, but Miller's performance was crystal clear. He was a seasoned actor on a familiar stage. The camera, clipped to his chest, showed his point of view. The approach to the car, the initial confrontation with Marcus, the demand for his license. His voice was a perfect blend of authority and feigned patience. He kept Marcus's hands in the frame, a textbook move to demonstrate that the suspect was not a threat. The footage showed the pat-down, Miller's hands moving over Marcus's body, finding nothing. Then, just as Miller moved toward the trunk, the footage cut out. A simple, blue screen appeared with the digital text. Recording ended, low battery. It was a perfect, tidy, and utterly damning lie. Elena watched it a dozen times, her frustration mounting. The report was right. The crucial moment, the search of the trunk, was gone. Miller had executed his plan flawlessly. He had kept the camera on for the innocent part of the interaction, creating a record of his own professionalism, and then killed it just before committing the crime. But Elena was a lawyer who had built her career on the belief that no lie is perfect. She knew that the most damning evidence is often not in what you see, but in what you don't. She wasn't looking at the footage as a story. She was looking at it as a piece of data. She imported the video file into a forensic analysis program, a tool that could break the video down into its constituent parts, revealing its metadata, its digital DNA. She looked past the images and began to examine the code. And that's where she found the first crack in Miller's perfect wall. The low battery shutdown had created a log entry, but the log entry was wrong. The battery hadn't been low. The timestamp on the shutdown command indicated that the battery had been at 87% capacity. The camera hadn't died. It had been manually turned off. It was a significant inconsistency, but it wasn't a smoking gun. A good prosecutor would argue that Miller, in the heat of the moment, had accidentally hit the button. She needed more. She continued to dig, frame by digital frame. She focused on the final, chaotic seconds before the screen went black. As Miller turned towards the trunk, the camera had swung wildly for a fraction of a second. It was a blur of motion, a chaotic smear of light and shadow. To the naked eye, it was useless. But Elena, using the analysis software, slowed it down to 1/50th of its normal speed. She began to step through it, one frame at a time. And in that chaotic blur, she found it. For a single, solitary frame, 1/30th of a second of recorded time. As Miller's arm moved across his body, the camera's lens had caught a reflection in the polished, dark paint of the Lexus's trunk lid. The image was distorted, warped by the curve of the metal, but it was there. It was a perfect, clear reflection of Officer Miller's hand. And in that hand, held between his thumb and forefinger, was the small, clear, glassing baggie of white powder. It was the plant. The footage then showed his hand moving out of frame towards the trunk's interior, and in the very next frame, the recording ended. Elena stared at the screen, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across her face. It was the Rosetta Stone of the entire case. Miller hadn't just turned off his camera to hide a crime. He had, in a moment of supreme, arrogant carelessness, filmed himself preparing to commit it. The lie wasn't just in the missing footage. It was in the single, damning frame he had forgotten to erase. She had him. She immediately filed a motion to dismiss, submitting the single, explosive frame as evidence. She also filed a formal complaint against Officer Miller for tampering with evidence and falsifying a police report. The prosecutor's office, faced with this irrefutable digital proof of a setup, was cornered. But the system does not like to admit its mistakes, especially when those mistakes wear a badge. The initial response was not an apology, but a wall of institutional resistance. The prosecutor's office filed a counter-motion, claiming the reflection was an unidentifiable digital artifact, a trick of the light. They accused Elena of fabricating evidence, of trying to win her case with a technological parlor trick. They were going to fight. They were going to try and bury the truth, just as Miller had tried to bury her client. The battle for Marcus Hayes's freedom was no longer about a simple drug charge. It was now a war against the entire, corrupt machinery of the city's justice system. The prosecutor's decision to fight was a declaration of war. They weren't just defending a bad cop. They were defending the blue wall of silence, the unwritten code that the system protects its own, no matter the cost. Elena knew that the single frame of reflected evidence, while damning to her, could be easily spun by a skilled prosecutor as a blurry anomaly to a skeptical jury. She needed to corroborate it. She needed to prove not just that Miller had planted the drugs, but that he was the kind of cop who would plant drugs. She needed to find a pattern. She shifted her focus from the video file to the man himself, Officer Daniel Miller. She filed a series of discovery motions, demanding access to his entire professional record, his arrest history, his complaint file, every piece of body camera footage he had ever filed. The department fought her at every turn, burying her in a mountain of procedural delays and redacted documents. But Elena was relentless. For 2 weeks, she and her small team of paralegals worked out of a war room in her office, fueled by coffee and a cold, righteous fury. They began to build a secret, second case, not against Marcus, but against Miller. They cross-referenced his arrest reports with the outcomes of the cases. A pattern began to emerge. Miller had an unusually high number of arrests for drug possession that were later thrown out in court due to evidence handling irregularities. He was a cop who was good at making arrests, but whose evidence often fell apart under scrutiny. The real breakthrough came from the body camera footage. They reviewed hundreds of hours of Miller's traffic stops, and they found it. A habit, a tell. In 3 separate, prior arrests, just before a suspect was found to be in possession of narcotics, Miller would perform the exact same subtle ritual. He would complain about a technical glitch with his camera, reach up to his chest to adjust it, and for a few critical seconds, the camera's view would be conveniently obstructed by his hand or aimed at the sky. Then, miraculously, the camera would be fixed, just in time to film the discovery of the drugs. It was his signature, the quiet, procedural dance of a man who knew how to manipulate the all-seeing eye of accountability. Elena now had the pattern, but she needed the final, human piece of the puzzle. She needed another victim. Her team began the painstaking work of tracking down the defendants from Miller's overturned cases. Most were ghosts, lost back to the streets, unwilling to talk, terrified of police retaliation. But then they found him. An older man named David, a former addict who was now 2 years clean, working a steady job at a local diner. He had been one of Miller's lucky ones. His case had been thrown out because Miller had forgotten to log the evidence properly. David, who had nothing left to lose and a deep, burning need for justice, agreed to talk. He told Elena the same story Marcus had told her: a routine stop, an aggressive officer, and the sudden, magical appearance of drugs that were not his. He was willing to testify. Armed with a pattern of behavior and a corroborating witness, Elena filed a new, explosive motion with the court. She was no longer just asking for a dismissal. She was asking for a full evidentiary hearing into Officer Miller's conduct, and she was formally accusing the Chicago PD of a systematic cover-up. The prosecutor, seeing his case against Marcus crumbling and a much larger, more dangerous scandal now looming, was finally forced to fold. He called Elena with an offer. They would drop all charges against Marcus Hayes immediately, provided she dropped her complaint against Officer Miller. "Let it go, Elena," the prosecutor had said, his voice weary. "You won. Your client walks. Don't burn the whole building down." Elena looked at the evidence spread across her desk, the single, damning frame, the pattern of obstructed cameras, the sworn testimony of another of Miller's victims. To accept the deal would be to save her client, but to let the monster walk free, to continue hunting on the city's dark streets. It was the safe choice, the one that would allow the system to quietly bury its mistake and move on. She thought of Marcus, a brilliant young man whose life had almost been destroyed. And she thought of all the other Marcuses, the ones who didn't have a wealthy family, the ones who couldn't afford a lawyer like her. She gave the prosecutor her answer. "No deal," she said, her voice cold as steel. "We're not just winning a case. We're taking down a predator. I'll see you in court." Elena's refusal of the deal was an act of open defiance, a declaration that she would not be a quiet participant in the system's cleanup. She was forcing a public reckoning. The evidentiary hearing was set, and the story, which had been a minor local news item, exploded. The media, smelling a major police corruption scandal, descended on the courthouse. The hearing room was packed. On one side sat Marcus and his family, their faces a mixture of anxiety and a new, fragile hope. On the other, in full dress uniform, sat Officer Daniel Miller, his face a mask of cold, arrogant fury, flanked by a team of high-powered union lawyers. He was not a man on trial. He was a king in his own courtroom, surrounded by his loyal court. Elena's strategy was a masterclass in methodical deconstruction. She did not begin with accusations or emotion. She began with the machine. She called a digital forensics expert to the stand, who testified under oath that the body camera had not died from a low battery, but had been manually deactivated. He then presented the single, stabilized frame, enlarged on a massive screen for the entire courtroom to see. The clear, unmistakable reflection of Miller's hand, holding the baggie of cocaine, just before it disappeared into the trunk. The image was a silent, digital scream. Next, she presented the pattern. She played the 3 other body camera videos, the ones where Miller had complained of a glitch and conveniently obstructed the camera just moments before a drug discovery. The pattern of deception was so clear, so blatant, that a ripple of shock went through the gallery. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a method. Then, she called her star witness, David, the older man who was now 2 years clean. He walked to the stand, his hands trembling slightly, but his voice clear and strong. He told his story, a story that was a perfect, heartbreaking echo of Marcus's own. He looked directly at Miller. "That man," he said, his voice ringing with the authority of a survivor. "He is not a peace officer. He is a predator. He preys on the weak, the ones he thinks no one will believe. He almost destroyed my life." And he did it with a smile on his face. The final act was the cross-examination of Officer Miller himself. He was calm, collected, and utterly dismissive. He and his lawyers had an answer for everything. The reflected image? A digital artifact. The other videos? Standard procedure to check equipment. David's testimony. The desperate lies of a known drug addict. He was untouchable, wrapped in the armor of his badge and the system's unwavering protection. Elena had one final card to play. She walked to the podium, holding a single, final piece of evidence. "Officer Miller," she began, her voice quiet. "I want to ask you about your training. You are trained to identify and log all potential evidence at a scene. Is that correct?" "Of course," Miller said with a sneer. "It's basic police work." Elena then projected a new image on the screen. It was another frame from the body camera, from the first few seconds of the traffic stop, when Miller was approaching the car. It showed the side of the Lexus, and on the ground, near the rear tire, was a small, dark object. "Can you identify this object for the court, officer?" Miller squinted. "It looks like a phone." "That's right," Elena said. "A smartphone, on the ground, screen side up. It belonged to a resident of that street who was recording you from her window." A recording which, by the way, we have. But that is not the important part. The important part is this. She zoomed in on the phone's dark, reflective screen. In its reflection, at a different angle from the trunk, was another, clearer image. Officer Miller, standing by the open door of his patrol car, just before approaching the Lexus. And in the reflection, he was clearly visible, taking the small, glassine baggie from his tactical vest and slipping it into his hand. He had been preparing his trap before he had even said a single word to Marcus Hayes. The courtroom erupted. Miller's face, for the first time, crumpled, his arrogant mask shattering to reveal the panicked, cornered man beneath. The union lawyer was shouting, "Objection!" But it was too late. The lie had been utterly, completely, and surgically dismantled. The judge slammed her gavel, but the sound was drowned out by the roar of a truth that could no longer be silenced. The aftermath was a seismic event that shook the foundations of the Chicago PD. The case against Marcus Hayes was not just dismissed, it was expunged with a rare and profound apology from the judge. Officer Daniel Miller was suspended, then arrested, and ultimately convicted of perjury, falsifying a police report, and a string of civil rights violations. His career, built on a foundation of lies and prejudice, ended in a prison cell. The scandal forced the department into a federal consent decree, a top-to-bottom reform of its policies on evidence handling and the use of body cameras. The Miller Reflection, as it became known in legal circles, became a case study in digital forensics, a testament to the fact that in the modern world, there are no perfect crimes. For Marcus, the victory was both total and transformative. He was awarded a multi-million-dollar settlement from the city, a sum he used not for himself, but to start a foundation. The Hayes Foundation for Systemic Justice provided pro bono legal services and a rapid response team of digital forensic experts for victims of police misconduct. He had walked into the system as a victim, and he had emerged as a warrior. He did not return to his promising career in architecture. The experience had changed him, reforged his ambitions. He enrolled in law school, his goal no longer to build beautiful buildings, but to dismantle unjust systems. He remained close with Elena Rodriguez, who became a founding member of his foundation's board. They had not just been a lawyer and a client. They had been partners in a war, and their victory had forged an unbreakable bond. One evening, a year after the trial, Marcus stood before a class of first-year law students at the University of Chicago. He was a guest lecturer, a role he had taken on with a passion that surprised him. He was no longer the quiet, compliant young man who had been pulled over on a dark street. He was a leader, his voice clear and resonant, filled with the hard-won authority of a survivor. He told his story, not as a tragedy, but as a lesson about the persistence of old hatreds and the power of new technologies. A lesson about the importance of doubt, of questioning, of looking for the truth in the reflections and the shadows. The system is not designed to be just, he told the room of bright, hopeful faces. It is designed to be powerful. It is our job, it is your job, to force it to be just. You must be smarter than the system. You must be more relentless than the system. And you must always believe your client, especially when the world tells you not to. After the lecture, as he walked out into the cool Chicago night, his phone buzzed. It was a message from David, the other victim of Miller's schemes, the man whose testimony had been so crucial. The message was a simple photo of David and his family, smiling, in front of a small, new house. First mortgage payment, the caption read, "Thanks to you, I got my life back. Thank you." Marcus smiled, a genuine, tired, and deeply satisfied smile. His own life had been derailed, his dreams shattered and rebuilt into something new, something more profound. He had not just saved himself. He had, in his own small, powerful way, begun to balance the scales. The ghost story his father had told him was still real, but he had written a new chapter, a chapter where, for once, the monster did not win.